Gold digger. The words hung in the air like expensive perfume at the Harrington family's annual charity gala. I wasn't supposed to hear them, of course. Elizabeth Harrington, my mother-in-law, had whispered them behind her crystal champagne. Flute to her circle of country club friends, her eyes darting toward me as I stood alone by the marble fountain. 3 years of marriage to her son Andrew, and I was still the outsider they tolerated with thin smiles and backhanded compliments. If only they knew that tomorrow morning, every newspaper in Boston would announce that I, Olivia Chen Harrington, was the anonymous buyer who had acquired controlling interest in Harrington Global Enterprises 6 months ago. The company that had been their family legacy for generations was now mine. I smoothed the simple black dress I'd bought off the rack at a department store, a stark contrast to the designer gowns that surrounded me. I'd been called worse things in my journey, from the daughter of immigrants who owned a small grocery store, to where I stood now. Gold digger was just the latest in a string of underestimations that had worked to my advantage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I remember the first time I set foot in the Harrington mansion in Beacon Hill. Everything gleamed with old money confidence. The chandelier that had once hung in a European palace, the paintings by artists whose names were dropped in casual conversation, the antique furniture that had stories, attached to every scratch and mark. I had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment above my parents' grocery store in Dorchester, where luxury meant having enough left over at the end of the month to add to my college fund. My father had taught me 2 things I never forgot: the value of hard work and the power of silent observation. "The loudest person in the room is rarely the smartest," he would say as we watched customers interact in the store. "Watch how people move, how they speak when they think no one important is listening." That lesson served me well at MIT, where I earned my business degree while working nights at the store. It served me even better when I founded my first tech startup focused on supply chain optimization. And it became invaluable when I met Andrew Harrington at a tech conference where he was speaking about emerging markets. I still remember his opening line when he approached me at the reception afterward. "You were the only person who challenged my point about Southeast Asian manufacturing trends," he said, handing me a glass of sparkling water. Everyone else was nodding along. "I lived those trends," I replied. "My family is from that region. What looks like a data point on your slides was my cousin's reality." That was 5 years ago. Unlike his family, Andrew valued perspectives that challenged his own. Where they saw differences as deficiencies, he saw them as strengths. We connected over shared values rather than shared backgrounds, believing that business could be both profitable and ethical, that innovation came from diversity of thought, that merit mattered more than connections. When he proposed after a year of dating, the Harrington family's reaction was immediate and barely concealed. His sister Charlotte had pulled him aside at the engagement party, not realizing I was within earshot. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Drew?" The Harrington name carries responsibilities. There are dozens of suitable matches within our circle. His father, Richard Harrington, had been more direct. "A prenuptial agreement is non-negotiable," he had declared during an uncomfortable dinner at their Beacon Hill home. "Family assets must be protected." I signed without hesitation. Their money had never interested me. I was building my own fortune, quietly and methodically, while they dismissed my work as a cute little startup. The sound of crystal tinkling against silver pulled me back to the present. Richard Harrington, imposing even at 70, stood at the center of the grand ballroom, calling for attention. "Friends, family, esteemed colleagues," he began, his Boston Brahmin accent perfected at prep schools and Ivy League universities. "Welcome to the 48th Annual Harrington Foundation Gala. As always, your generosity supports causes that uphold the traditions and values that have made this city great. I took a slow sip of my champagne, noting how his emphasis on traditions and values carried unspoken qualifiers about who belonged and who remained forever on the outside. Andrew appeared at my side, his hand finding the small of my back. At 35, he stood out among the Harrington men, less concerned with appearance and status, more focused on substance and impact. His position as head of international development at Harrington Global was earned through insight and innovation rather than birthright, though his family preferred to attribute his success to good breeding. "You look like you're plotting something," he whispered, his eyes crinkling with the smile that had first drawn me to him. "Just observing," I replied, which wasn't entirely untrue. I had spent 3 years observing the Harrington Empire, its strengths, its weaknesses, its vulnerability to precisely the kind of acquisition I had executed. Andrew's brother James approached, champagne sloshing slightly in his glass. As CFO of Harrington Global, he projected an image of financial acumen that the quarterly reports, which would soon be on my desk, contradicted sharply. "Ah, the happy couple," James said with the particular tone that suggested we were anything but. "Olivia, my dear, that's an interesting dress, so refreshingly simple." "Thank you, James," I replied with a practiced smile. "I find excessive displays distracting when there's real work to be done." His smile tightened. "Yes, well, some of us manage both appearances and substance. Speaking of which," he turned to Andrew, effectively dismissing me, "there's someone you need to meet. Margaret Whittington's daughter has just returned from London, with fascinating insights into the European market." I caught the subtext immediately. Another suitable woman was being paraded before my husband. This happened regularly enough that it had become almost amusing. "I'm sure Olivia would enjoy that conversation too," Andrew replied, his tone pleasant but firm. "Her technology is already being implemented in 3 European capitals." James's smile never reached his eyes. "Of course, though this is rather high-level strategy discussion." "Then Olivia is exactly who you want in the conversation," Andrew countered. "No one thinks more strategically." I placed a hand on Andrew's arm. "Actually, I promised your mother I'd discuss the seating arrangements for Thanksgiving. You two go ahead." It was a graceful exit that served multiple purposes. Andrew could network without the tension my presence sometimes created, and I could continue my careful observation of the company's key shareholders, many of whom were in attendance tonight. I made my way across the ballroom, nodding at familiar faces while cataloging mental notes about who spoke with whom, which board members clustered together, which family allies seemed to be drifting toward different power centers. Olivia. Elizabeth Harrington materialized before me, elegant in designer black with pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. "I was just telling the Winchesters about your little computer business. They have a niece who's quite interested in that sort of thing. Perhaps you could offer her some advice." The dismissive way she said computer business to describe my technology company that now employed over 200 people and had revolutionized supply chain management across 3 continents was so predictable it almost made me smile. "I'd be happy to," I replied. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Is she interested in artificial intelligence applications, or more on the hardware integration side? Elizabeth blinked, clearly not having expected actual technical substance. "Oh, I wouldn't know about all that. Something with social media, I believe." "Not exactly my area, but I'm always glad to support young women in tech." I maintained the pleasant expression that had become my armor in these situations. Charlotte Harrington Bishop, Andrew's sister, approached with her husband Bradley, both radiating the particular confidence of people who had never had to prove their worth to anyone. "Mother, the Cavendishes have arrived," Charlotte announced before acknowledging me with a tight nod. "Olivia." "Charlotte, Bradley," I greeted them. "Lovely event, as always." "Family tradition," Charlotte replied with emphasis on family that excluded me from the concept. Though I suppose these kinds of social obligations must seem quite foreign to you still. 3 years of marriage, and Charlotte still positioned me as a perpetual newcomer, an immigrant to their social world who would never be granted citizenship. On the contrary, I said lightly, in my community, social obligations are the foundation of everything. We just focus more on substance than appearance. Bradley, never one to miss an opportunity to demonstrate his economic knowledge despite his hedge fund's mediocre performance, jumped in. Speaking of substance, have you heard about this mystery investor buying up Harrington Global shares? Quite the topic among the board members tonight. My pulse quickened slightly, but my expression remained neutral. Oh? That sounds concerning. Charlotte waved a dismissive hand. Daddy says it's nothing to worry about. Probably some investment fund that doesn't understand the value of family stewardship. They'll be brought in line at the next board meeting. If only they knew that the documents in my evening clutch contained proof of exactly who that mystery investor was, and that, brought in line, was precisely what I intended to do to the current management at tomorrow's 9 a.m. board meeting. I'm sure your father knows best, I replied, the irony of my statement known only to me. The evening continued in this vein, conversations layered with subtle dismissals, questions about when Andrew and I would start a family, with the unspoken suggestion that my career was an unfortunate obstacle. Comments about my background, framed as compliments about how far I'd come. Throughout it all, I maintained the role I'd played for 3 years, the tolerated outsider, the woman who should be grateful for her acceptance, however conditional, into this rarefied world. What none of them had bothered to discover was that my little computer business had grown into a technology powerhouse that specialized in optimizing operations for manufacturing and logistics companies. My algorithms could identify inefficiencies, invisible to traditional analyses. My client list included 3 Fortune 50 companies and government contracts in 2 countries. And for the past 18 months, my most intense focus had been on Harrington Global Enterprises, analyzing its vulnerabilities, identifying its undervalued assets, and recognizing that beneath the veneer of old money, success lay a company, desperately in need of modernization. The opportunity had presented itself when my analysis showed that Harrington Global was more vulnerable than anyone realized. Poor investments championed by James had left them cash poor despite appearances, and their stock was significantly undervalued due to outdated reporting structures that obscured the company's true potential. I had made my decision not out of revenge for the countless slights and assumptions, but because I saw a path to transform a good company that was being squandered by incompetent leadership. Andrew loved that company, its history, its potential, the thousands of employees who depended on it. But his family was driving it into the ground while congratulating themselves on their business acumen. Through a series of shell companies and investment vehicles, I had quietly acquired shares whenever the price dipped. No single purchase was large enough to trigger reporting requirements, but together they had accumulated to just over 51% of voting shares. The final transaction had cleared last week, and tomorrow's board meeting would be unlike any the Harrington family had experienced in their 48 years of running the company. There you are. Andrew's voice pulled me from my thoughts as he rejoined me near the grand staircase. Ready to head out? We've made our appearance, and I know these events drain you. This was one of countless reasons I had fallen in love with him. His awareness of when I needed rescue, his willingness to break from family expectations when they didn't serve a greater purpose. Actually, I'd like to stay a bit longer, I replied, surprising him. Your father mentioned he wanted to make some company announcement later. Andrew raised an eyebrow. Since when are you interested in Dad's ceremonial pronouncements? It's usually just an excuse to remind everyone. How long the Harringtons have controlled Boston business? Professional curiosity, I said, which was true enough. Besides, I'm enjoying observing tonight. He studied my face with the attention that had initially drawn us together. "You've been different lately. More." He searched for the word. "Present in these family events. Is everything okay?" I reached up to straighten his bow tie, a gesture of intimacy amid the calculated formality surrounding us. "Everything is exactly as it should be." The decision to keep Andrew in the dark had been the hardest part of my plan. We shared everything, except this. I told myself it was to protect him from conflict of interest, to ensure he couldn't be accused of collusion. But the truth had another dimension. I needed to do this myself, to gain control through my own business acumen rather than through marital connection. "The company would be better with you in leadership," Andrew had said months ago after a particularly frustrating executive meeting where his innovative proposals for Asian market expansion were shelved in favor of his cousin's pet project. "Maybe someday," I'd replied, already knowing my plan was well in motion. As midnight approached, Richard Harrington again called for attention, this time standing on the grand staircase with James and the other executives flanking him like courtiers, around a king. "Before we conclude our evening," he announced, "I want to address some rumors that may have reached you. Yes, there has been unusual activity in our company's stock. Some unknown entity has been acquiring shares." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I felt Andrew tense beside me. "I want to assure all of you, our family, friends, and business partners, that Harrington Global Enterprises remains firmly under family control, as it has been for nearly 5 decades. Our legal team is investigating these purchases and will ensure that any new shareholders understand the Harrington way of doing business." The confidence in his voice was absolute, the product of a lifetime of never being seriously challenged. James stood at his right hand, smirking slightly at the implied threat to the unknown investor. If they only knew that investor was standing, in their ballroom, in an off-the-rack dress, with documents in her evening bag that would forever change the power dynamics of this carefully ordered world. "We'll address this minor issue at tomorrow's board meeting," Richard continued, "and then move forward with the aggressive growth strategy James has developed." I suppressed a smile, knowing exactly how flawed that strategy was, how it prioritized short-term gains that would benefit executive bonuses over sustainable growth, to the next 50 years of Harrington leadership. Richard raised his glass, and the room dutifully followed suit. Later, as our car pulled away from the mansion, Andrew seemed troubled. "That investor situation is more serious than Dad's letting on. We've never had anyone accumulate more than 8% besides family members. James is actually worried, though he'd never admit it publicly." I looked out at the Boston skyline, the city lights reflecting off the harbor. "Perhaps change wouldn't be the worst thing for Harrington Global." Andrew sighed. "In theory, no. The company needs modernization, better technology integration, more diverse perspectives in leadership. But you know my family, they equate change with weakness." I reached for his hand. "And what do you think?" "I think," he said slowly, "that the right kind of change could transform Harrington Global. Into the company it has the potential to be, but it would take someone with vision, technological understanding, and enough backbone to stand up to decades of, 'We've always done it this way.'" I smiled in the darkness of the car. "Sounds like you have someone in mind." "Honestly, someone like you," he said. "The way you've built your company from nothing, how you see opportunities others miss, your ability to optimize systems that seem too complex to untangle." He laughed softly. "But can you imagine my family's reaction to that suggestion? They still act like your business is a hobby." The irony was almost too perfect. "People often don't see what's right in front of them," I replied. "Especially when it contradicts what they've always believed." At home, our penthouse apartment that I had purchased before meeting Andrew, another fact his family conveniently overlooked when painting me as a social climber, I prepared for the next day with meticulous attention. My outfit was selected for the message it would send. A perfectly tailored designer suit I'd actually paid full price for, one of my few fashion indulgences. Professional, powerful, but without the flashy labels the Harrington women favored. My presentation materials were prepared, my legal team briefed, my talking points reviewed one final time. "Coming to bed?" Andrew called from the bedroom. "In a minute," I replied, closing my laptop where the press release announcing the new leadership of Harrington Global Enterprises was drafted and ready to send. Tomorrow would change everything. For the company, for the Harrington family, for my relationship with Andrew. I had built my plan with the precision that had made my technology so valuable, analyzing all variables, preparing for contingencies, optimizing for the best possible outcome. Yet standing on the precipice of this transformation, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. Not just the tactical acquisition of company shares, but the lifetime of being underestimated, overlooked, dismissed as less than I was because of my background, my gender, my unwillingness to perform status in the expected ways. Those underestimations had become my greatest advantage. They had allowed me to observe without being observed, to move without drawing attention, to build power while others were distracted by appearances. Tomorrow, the whispers of gold digger would be replaced by a new reality. And while part of me anticipated the shock on Elizabeth Harrington's face, with perhaps less than noble satisfaction, my true focus remained on what I could build from here. A company transformed by merit rather than inheritance. An organization where innovation wasn't stifled by tradition. A legacy defined by impact rather than exclusivity. I slipped into bed beside Andrew, his arm automatically finding its way around my waist. "Big presentation tomorrow?" he murmured, half asleep. I smiled in the darkness. "You could say that." "You'll be amazing," he said with complete confidence. "You always are." That was why, despite all the complications tomorrow would bring, I believed we would emerge stronger. Because beneath the family expectations and social performances, Andrew and I shared something real. A vision of what business could be, what marriage could be, what life could be when built on genuine value rather than inherited position. Tomorrow would test that foundation. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of simple appreciation for how far I had come and how much further I intended to go. The daughter of grocery store owners was about to take control of one of Boston's oldest family companies. Not through marriage, as the Harringtons had assumed, but through strategic brilliance they had been too arrogant to notice. In the morning, the real work would begin. Sleep did not come easily. I lay awake, listening to Andrew's steady breathing beside me, running through scenarios and contingencies as I had done countless times over the past year. The acquisition itself had been the simple part, a series of financial transactions, executed with surgical precision. Tomorrow would require a different kind of precision. The alarm sounded at 5:30, though I had been awake for an hour already. I slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Andrew, and began my morning ritual. With unusual deliberation, the shower, the precise application of makeup, professional but not overdone, the careful styling of my hair into a sleek chignon that conveyed authority without distraction. When I emerged from the bathroom, Andrew was sitting on the edge of the bed, already dressed in his usual boardroom attire. The surprise on his face when he saw me was evident. "You look..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Formidable." I smiled, adjusting the cuffs of my jacket. "Thank you. I have an important meeting after I drop you at the office." "Must be significant, that's your power suit." His eyes narrowed slightly. "New client?" "Something like that," I replied, maintaining the half-truths that had become necessary over the past months. "Actually, I was thinking I might attend the board meeting with you this morning." Now his surprise was complete. I had never shown interest in attending the monthly Harrington Global board meetings, despite having a standing invitation as his spouse. You want to sit through 3 hours of my father talking about legacy and tradition while James presents misleading financial projections? Andrew's tone was light, but the question was genuine. I thought it might be informative to see how a company of that size handles governance, I said, which wasn't entirely untrue. Consider it professional development. He laughed. Well, I won't complain about having you there. Fair warning, though, my father runs those meetings like a feudal lord holding court. I look forward to observing the dynamic, I replied, thinking about how dramatically that dynamic was about to change. We arrived at Harrington Tower at precisely 8:30 a.m. The glass and steel skyscraper dominated the Boston financial district. Its logo, a stylized H, meant to evoke both tradition and forward momentum, illuminated even in daylight, a constant reminder of the family's prominence. The executive elevator whisked us to the top floor where the boardroom occupied the prime corner position with views of both the harbor and the city skyline. As we approached, I noted the small groups of executives already gathering, their expressions more strained than usual, their conversations hushed. The rumors about the mystery shareholder had clearly spread beyond last night's gala. Good. Anxiety would make them less composed, less certain of their position. As a strategist, I knew that uncertainty was often the predecessor to change. Ms. Chen. Walter Green, the company's long-serving general counsel, approached us with unusual formality. Typically, he greeted me with the overly familiar, Olivia. Dear that many of the old guard used to subtly remind me of my outsider status. I wasn't aware you would be joining us today. Last-minute decision, Andrew answered before I could. She's interested in seeing how board governance works at our scale. Walter's smile was tight. Of course, though given today's sensitive agenda items, perhaps another meeting might be more appropriate. Is there a problem with my wife attending, Walter? Andrew's voice took on the edge it only got when someone challenged something he considered a matter of principle. Not at all, not at all. Walter backtracked smoothly. Just unusual, that's all. I believe the bylaws are quite clear that board members may invite observers with appropriate confidentiality agreements, which I've signed in the past, I noted pleasantly, unless something has changed. Walter's smile remained fixed. Of course, you're quite right. Well then, shall we? He gestured toward the boardroom doors. Inside, the tension was palpable. The massive oak table that dominated the room was already surrounded by board members and executives, their usual pre-meeting small talk replaced with intense conversations in small clusters. James stood with his father and 2 other senior executives, his face flushed with what appeared to be agitation. Richard Harrington looked up as we entered, his expression shifting from concern to confusion at my presence. Andrew, he nodded, then added with visible restraint, Olivia, this is unexpected. I invited her, Andrew said simply, pulling out a chair for me near his usual position midway down the table. She's interested in corporate governance. How fortunate, Richard replied with a tight smile, though today's agenda may include some family matters. I'm family, I pointed out mildly, taking my seat. The slight flinch was almost imperceptible, but it revealed everything about how Richard truly saw me, as a temporary complication, in the Harrington dynasty, not a permanent part of it. James approached, leaning down to speak quietly to his father, though not quietly enough that I couldn't hear. We should start. Harrison says the legal team has completed their analysis of the share acquisitions. Richard nodded and took his position at the head of the table. The room quieted immediately, the power of decades of conditioning, and the meeting was called to order with practiced formality. Before we address the standard agenda items, Richard began, I want to move directly to the matter of the recent share acquisitions. Walter, please update the board on your findings. Walter Green stood, adjusting his glasses with a nervous gesture I had never before seen from the usually composed attorney. As you know, we've been tracking unusual trading patterns in Harrington Global stock over the past 6 months. Initially, these appeared to be disparate purchases by multiple entities, none large enough to trigger SEC disclosure requirements. However, our investigation has revealed that these entities are, in fact, connected through a complex network of shell companies and investment vehicles. A ripple of unease moved through the boardroom. I kept my expression neutral, though I noted Andrew's increasing tension beside me. The ultimate controlling entity appears to be a private investment firm called Azimuth Partners, Walter continued. While Azimuth itself has a limited public profile, we believe it to be controlled by a technology company specializing in supply chain optimization. I felt Andrew go completely still beside me, the realization beginning to dawn. As of yesterday, Walter concluded with obvious reluctance, these combined entities hold approximately 51% of Harrington Global's voting shares. The room erupted into shock and outrage, board members talking over each other, demanding explanations, assigning blame. James slammed his hand on the table. This is impossible. How could we allow an outside entity to gain controlling interest without our knowledge? The purchases were deliberately structured to stay below regulatory thresholds, Walter explained, his professional demeanor straining. Each individual transaction appeared routine. It's only when viewed as a coordinated strategy that the pattern becomes clear. Who is behind this? Richard demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. Who controls Azimuth Partners? The moment had arrived. I placed my hands flat on the polished oak table and rose to my feet. The room fell suddenly, completely silent. I do, I said simply. For several seconds, no one moved. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the building's HVAC system. What did you say? Richard finally managed, his face a study in disbelief. I said, I control Azimuth Partners. My voice was calm, measured, and, by extension, as of 9 o'clock this morning, I control 51% of Harrington Global Enterprises. The explosion was immediate. James leapt. To his feet, his face contorted with rage. This is preposterous. A joke. There's no possible way. It's neither preposterous nor a joke, I interrupted, opening the portfolio I had brought with me. The documentation is all here. Ownership records, transfer confirmations, legal opinions confirming the validity of the transactions. Everything executed in full compliance with securities regulations and corporate bylaws. I began distributing copies of the documents I had prepared. Concise summaries of the transactions, validation from top legal and financial firms, and a detailed ownership diagram showing the path from my technology company through various entities to the controlling stake in Harrington Global. This can't be legal, Richard stammered, staring at the papers before him as if they might transform into something less threatening if he glared hard enough. There must be regulations against this kind of hostile takeover? I supplied the term he seemed reluctant to use. Actually, there's nothing hostile about it. I purchased shares on the open market at fair value. I've simply exercised my right as an investor to acquire ownership in a publicly traded company. Andrew was staring at the documents, then at me, his expression a complex mixture of shock, confusion, and something I couldn't quite identify. Olivia, he said quietly, what have you done? What needed to be done? I replied, meeting his gaze directly. Charlotte, who served as the company's chief marketing officer despite her limited qualifications, found her voice. This is absurd. You can't possibly have the resources to acquire a controlling stake in a company of this size. I smiled slightly. Your consistent underestimation of my capabilities has been one of my greatest advantages, Charlotte. My technology company has been valued at over $2 billion for the past 18 months. More than sufficient to finance this acquisition. $2 billion. James repeated numbly. That's impossible. Your little startup is the leading provider of AI-driven supply chain optimization systems in the world. I completed his sentence. With contracts across 5 continents and a client list that includes 40% of the Fortune 100. Information that has been publicly available for anyone who bothered to look beyond their assumptions about me. Richard seemed to recover. Some of his composure, his shock hardening into cold anger. Whatever game you're playing, it ends now. The Harrington family has controlled this company for nearly 5 decades. We have relationships, agreements, understandings with partners and clients that go beyond mere share ownership. I'm well aware, I replied, maintaining my calm. Which is why I've spent the past year studying every aspect of Harrington Global's operations, partnerships, and market position. I understand this company's strengths and weaknesses better than most of the people in this room. Richard struggled for words. This is a betrayal of the most personal kind. I met his gaze directly. Is it a betrayal to save a company from mismanagement? To protect thousands of jobs that your aggressive growth strategy would eliminate? To preserve and strengthen a legacy rather than watching it crumble under the weight of complacency and nepotism? You married my son to get to our company, James accused, his face flushed with anger. We were right about you all along. Andrew stood then, his voice sharp with an anger I rarely heard from him. That's enough, James. Can't you see what she's done? James continued, gesturing wildly. She used you, used our name, used our connections. Actually, I countered calmly, I made my first $1 million before I ever met Andrew. My company was already successful when we began dating. And I've never once used the Harrington name to advance my business interests. Quite the opposite. In fact, your family's reputation for being resistant to innovation and technology has been something I've had to overcome with clients. Walter Green, ever the lawyer, had been reviewing the documents with increasing distress. He looked up, his expression grave. These appear to be in order. Ms. Chen, or rather Mrs. Harrington, does indeed appear to have acquired controlling interest through legal means. This is unacceptable, Richard declared. The board serves at the pleasure of the majority shareholder, I reminded him gently, as do the officers of the company. The implications of this statement landed like a physical blow. Richard sank slowly back into his chair, the full reality of the situation finally registering. You're firing us, Charlotte said, her voice hollow with disbelief. Your own family. Not necessarily, I replied. I'm instituting a performance review of all executive positions, effective immediately. Those who demonstrate genuine value and expertise will be retained. Those who hold their positions solely through family connection rather than merit will be offered generous severance packages. I turned to face the non-family board members and executives who had been watching this drama unfold with various degrees of shock, and in some cases, poorly concealed satisfaction. Harrington Global has tremendous potential that has been systematically squandered through outdated practices, resistance to innovation, and preference for tradition over effectiveness. That changes today, not through destruction, but through transformation. I opened my laptop and projected a presentation onto the room's main screen, the vision I had developed over months of careful analysis and planning. These are my initial priorities as majority shareholder. First, a complete technological overhaul of our manufacturing and logistics systems, implementing AI-driven optimization that will increase efficiency by an estimated 32% while reducing waste by over 40%. I advanced to the next slide, showing financial projections based on my company's proprietary algorithms. Second, a reorganization of our international division to capitalize on emerging markets in Southeast Asia and Africa, markets that Andrew has correctly identified as high potential, but which have been consistently under-resourced in favor of maintaining traditional European relationships. Andrew's expression shifted subtly at this, surprise giving way to a dawning understanding as he recognized his own strategies in my presentation. Third, the establishment of a genuine meritocracy throughout the organization. Promotion based on performance and innovation rather than tenure or family connection. Investment in employee development at all levels. Elimination of the artificial barriers that have prevented talented individuals from advancing within the company. I paused, surveying the room. Some faces remained hostile, particularly James and Charlotte, but others among the executives showed cautious interest, even hope. They had known the company was stagnating, but had been powerless to challenge the family's control. Finally, a complete reassessment of our community impact. Harrington Global has the resources and position to be a leader in ethical business practices, environmental sustainability, and genuine social responsibility. Not performative charity galas, but meaningful investment in the communities where we operate. Richard had been watching in silent fury, but now he rose again, drawing himself up to his full height. "This is still a Harrington company," he declared, his voice trembling slightly. "You may have bought shares, but you cannot buy a legacy. Our partners, our clients, they deal with us because of who we are, because of what the Harrington name represents." I met his gaze steadily. The Harrington name will remain, but it will represent something better. A company that values innovation over tradition, merit over birthright, impact over appearance. The kind of company that Andrew has been trying to help you build for years, only to be dismissed and overruled. At the mention of his name, all eyes turned to Andrew, who had remained silent throughout my presentation. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his reaction. Would he stand with his family against me, or would he embrace the vision I had just outlined? He looked at me, then at his father, then back to me. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the competing loyalties, the processing of the deception I had maintained even with him. "You should have told me," he said quietly, the hurt evident in his voice. "I know," I acknowledged. "That was the hardest part of all this. But I needed to do this independently, to ensure that there could be no accusations of insider trading or improper influence. Andrew," Richard appealed to his son, "you cannot possibly support this coup." Andrew was silent for a long moment, looking at the presentation still displayed on the screen, at the documents on the table, at the faces around the room watching him intently. "Dad," he finally said, "for 5 years I've been telling you that the company needs to modernize, that our traditional approaches are becoming obsolete, that we're losing market share to more innovative competitors." He gestured to the presentation. "Everything Olivia is proposing, these are the changes I've been advocating for years." "You can't be serious," James interjected. "She deceived all of us, including you. She married into this family with an agenda." Andrew shook his head. "I know my wife, James. Whatever else has happened here, I know that Olivia didn't marry me for my family connections or for access to this company." He turned to me. "She married me despite my family, not because of it." The truth of that statement registered on several faces around the table. They had witnessed firsthand how the family had treated me over the years, how little advantage the Harrington connection had seemed to offer me. "As for the deception," Andrew continued, "I don't approve of the methods, but I understand the necessity." He looked directly at his father. "Would you have even considered selling a controlling interest if she had approached you openly? Would you have given her ideas a fair hearing?" Richard's silence was answer enough. "So," I said, addressing the room once more, "we have a choice to make today. We can waste time and resources fighting a legally binding change in ownership, damaging the company and its value in the process. Or we can work together to transform Harrington Global into the company it has the potential to be." I looked at each person around the table in turn. I don't want to destroy what Richard and his father built. I want to evolve it, strengthen it, prepare it for the next 50 years. And I'm prepared to work with anyone who shares that vision, family or not, provided they bring genuine value and expertise to the table. Walter Green cleared his throat. From a legal perspective, Mrs. Harrington's position as majority shareholder is clear. She has the authority to implement these changes, including board and executive reorganization, if she chooses. Richard's shoulders slumped slightly, the first sign of defeat I had ever seen from him. "This is still my company," he said, but the certainty had drained from his voice. "It's our company now," I corrected gently, "and it can be stronger for having both your experience and my vision, if you're willing to adapt." The room fell silent again as the full impact of the morning's revelations settled over everyone present. The Harrington dynasty had just experienced its first genuine challenge in nearly 5 decades. The carefully ordered hierarchy of family control had been upended not by an outside corporate raider, but by the very woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a gold-digging outsider who had somehow caught the eye of the second son. I caught Andrew's gaze across the table. The hurt was still there, but alongside it was something else, a reluctant admiration, perhaps even pride. We would have much to discuss later, in private. But for now, in this boardroom that had seen generations of Harrington men making decisions unchallenged, we had work to do. The whispers of gold digger had been silenced forever. In their place stood the new CEO of Harrington Global Enterprises, ready to transform more than just a company, but the very definition of what it meant to bear the Harrington name. The rest of the board meeting proceeded with a surreal quality. The standard agenda items addressed with mechanical precision despite the seismic shift that had just occurred. Financial reports were presented, operational updates delivered, all while the underlying reality had fundamentally changed. I noted how the non-family executives began directing their comments to me rather than Richard, the swift recalibration of power dynamics making itself visible in 100 small ways. When the meeting finally adjourned 3 hours later, Richard immediately retreated to his office with Walter Green and 2 other long-serving board members. James stormed out without a word, nearly knocking over his chair in the process. Charlotte remained frozen in place, staring at her reflection in the polished table surface as if trying to process a world that no longer followed her expected script. Andrew and I were the last to leave the boardroom. As the door closed behind us, he turned to me in the empty hallway, his voice low but intense. "We need to talk." "Yes," I agreed. "But not here." The trip back to our apartment passed in tense silence. I could feel Andrew processing, analyzing, reassessing every conversation we'd had over the past year. Every late night I'd attributed to my own business, every question I'd asked about Harrington Global that might now seem calculated rather than merely curious. Once inside our home, he went straight to the bar and poured himself a whiskey, something he rarely did before evening. He didn't offer me one. "How long?" he finally asked, his back still to me. "How long have you been planning this?" "The acquisition strategy began 18 months ago," I answered honestly. "But the recognition that Harrington Global needed transformation? That started the first time you brought me to a board meeting 3 years ago." He turned to face me. "You sat through that meeting and saw what? Prey? A vulnerable target?" "No," I said firmly. "I saw a good company with tremendous potential being limited by outdated thinking. I saw talented people whose ideas were dismissed because they didn't have the right last name. I saw your frustration every time your father or James rejected innovation in favor of tradition. So you decided to take matters into your own hands?" There was an edge to his voice I rarely heard. "Without telling me? Without giving me any choice in how my family's legacy would be transformed?" "Would you have supported me if I had told you?" I asked directly. "Would you have been comfortable with your wife taking control of your family's company?" He ran, a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I knew well. I don't know. I'll never know, because you didn't give me the chance to decide. I needed to do this independently, I explained. Not just legally, but personally. I needed to know I could accomplish this through my own business acumen, not through my connection to you. That's convenient, he said with uncharacteristic bitterness, framing deception as independence. The words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. You're right to be angry, I acknowledged. I kept something significant from you. But I hope you can see that my intentions for the company align with everything you've been fighting for within your family. Your intentions, he repeated, taking a long sip of his whiskey. You know what James and my parents think your intentions were? That you married me for access to the company. That you've been planning this from the beginning. That's not true, I said quietly. I fell in love with you because you saw me, really saw me, at a time when everyone else saw only what they expected to see. You valued my mind, my perspective, my difference rather than trying to force me into some predetermined mold. I moved to the window, looking out at the Boston skyline that held both our companies within its glass and steel forest. I built my company from nothing long before I met you. I never needed your family's money or connections. In fact, being associated with the Harrington name has often been an obstacle in the tech world, where your family is known for resisting innovation. Andrew was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from anger to something more complex, disappointment layered with reluctant understanding. You could have approached me. We could have worked together. And face accusations that you leaked insider information, that you colluded in a takeover, that would have compromised both of us. I turned back to him. This way, everything is clean, above board. My acquisition, based solely on public information and legal transactions. He set his glass down with deliberate care. And what happens now? To my father? To the company? To us? The last question hung in the air between us, laden with everything that remained unresolved. Your father has tremendous experience and institutional knowledge, I said. If he's willing to adapt, to embrace change rather than resist it, he could remain as chairman emeritus. His relationships with legacy clients are valuable. And James? Charlotte? James has been manipulating financial reports for years to hide his mistakes, I replied. The Singapore expansion failure alone cost the company millions, but he buried it in creative accounting. He's a liability we can't afford. Andrew didn't contradict me. He had known about his brother's financial maneuvering, but had been powerless to address it given the family dynamics. Charlotte has no qualifications for her position, I continued. But she has a strong network. If she's interested, she could transition to a role in foundation management or community relations, areas where her social connections would actually add value. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the assessment of his siblings that he had likely made himself years ago, but never voiced. And us? He asked again, the question that mattered most. I crossed the room to stand before him, close enough to see the conflict in his eyes but not touching him yet. That depends on whether you can forgive me for keeping this from you. Whether you can see that despite the deception, my underlying motivation was aligned with your own vision for the company. I've spent my entire life as a Harrington, he said slowly. Even when I disagreed with my family, even when I fought against their decisions I never imagined. That an outsider would take control, I finished for him. That my wife would transform my understanding of loyalty overnight. His expression was guarded now, measuring me in a way he never had before. I always thought we were partners, that we faced the world together, not as separate strategists, with independent agendas. The words cut deeper than any anger could have. We are partners, I insisted. Everything I've done, yes, Even this acquisition has been in service of a vision I believe we share. A vision of what business can be when it values merit over inheritance, innovation over tradition, actual impact over appearance. The vision, yes, he acknowledged, but not the method, not the secrecy. He moved away, creating physical distance that mirrored the emotional gulf that had opened between us. I watched him pace, recognizing his need to process, to adjust his mental model of our marriage and his place in his family's company. "I need time," he finally said. It's too much to absorb at once." "I understand." And I did. I had had months to prepare for this day, to understand its implications. He had had hours. "What do you need from me?" "Space," he replied without hesitation. "I'll stay at the Back Bay apartment tonight." My heart sank, but I nodded. The Back Bay apartment was a small place he had kept from before our marriage, occasionally used when he needed late nights at the office. He had never stayed there, because of conflict between us, until now. "And tomorrow?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Will you come to the office?" He paused at the door to our bedroom, where he would presumably pack an overnight bag. "I don't know yet. I need to think about what this means for my role at Harrington Global now that my wife is the controlling shareholder." The formal way he described me, my wife, rather than using my name, revealed the distance that had grown between us in the space of a morning. I had anticipated many reactions to my revelation, had planned for multiple scenarios, but somehow I had underestimated the personal cost of my strategy. "Andrew," I said as he turned to go, "I did this because I believed it was the only way to save the company you love from the family dynamics that were destroying it. Not because I wanted power, but because I saw what Harrington Global could become if freed from the constraints of tradition for tradition's sake." He looked back at me, his expression a complex mixture of hurt, confusion, and something else. A reluctant recognition that perhaps I understood his family's dysfunction better than he had been willing to admit. "Maybe that's true," he said quietly. "But you did it by becoming something I never thought you were. Someone who could maintain a deception for over a year, who could sit across from me every night and keep such a significant secret." "I'm still the same person," I insisted. "The person who believes in you, who shares your vision, who wants to build something meaningful together." "Are you?" he asked, and then disappeared into the bedroom without waiting for an answer. 20 minutes later, he emerged with an overnight bag. He paused at the door to our apartment, his hand on the knob, his back to me. "For what it's worth," he said without turning, "your presentation today, the vision you outlined for the company, it was everything I've been trying to get my father to understand for years." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a quiet click that somehow felt more final than any slam could have. Alone in our apartment, I moved to my home office and activated my secure line. There were calls to make, arrangements to finalize. The press release announcing the change in ownership would go out in 1 hour. By morning, the business world would be buzzing with the news that Harrington Global Enterprises was under new management. My CFO's face appeared on the screen. "It's done?" I nodded. "The board has been informed. The legal documentation is in place. We proceed as planned." "And the family?" she asked carefully. "Reacting as expected," I replied, keeping my voice professional despite the turmoil beneath the surface. "Richard may be persuaded to stay in an emeritus role. James and Charlotte will likely need to be transitioned out. The non-family executives seem open to the new direction." She nodded, making notes. "And Andrew?" I hesitated, the personal and professional blurring in a way I had tried so hard to prevent. "He needs time. The situation is complicated." "You knew it would be," she reminded me gently. "We had been friends since business school, long before I met Andrew. She was one of the few people who knew both the strategic and personal dimensions of what I had undertaken." Yes, I agreed. But knowing something intellectually isn't the same as experiencing it emotionally. She studied me through the screen. Do you regret it? The acquisition? No, I said without hesitation. The company needed this change. The stagnation, the nepotism, the resistance to innovation. It was destroying value and wasting potential. What I regret is the cost to my marriage, which I'm only beginning to understand. He might surprise you, she suggested. From everything you've told me, Andrew has been fighting for these same changes from within. Yes, but there's a difference. Between advocating for change and watching your wife take control of your family's legacy, I pointed out. The former maintains the illusion of family control, even in defeat. The latter transforms everything he thought he knew about his place in that legacy. After finishing the call and several others like it, to my legal team, to Key, investors to the PR firm that would manage the public narrative of the acquisition, I found myself alone with the weight of what I had accomplished and what I might have lost in the process. I walked through our apartment, suddenly aware of how the space represented the merging of our separate lives. His family photos beside my academic achievements, his collection of first-edition business books beside my technical journals, the blend of his traditional aesthetic with my more modern preferences. On his desk in the corner of the living room, a framed photo caught my eye. The two of us on a sailing trip in Maine, laughing into the camera with wind-blown hair and genuine joy. It had been taken 6 months into my acquisition strategy, during a rare weekend when both of us had stepped away from work. The woman in that photo had been keeping a monumental secret from the man she loved, yet the happiness captured in her expression was unquestionably real. Was that the contradiction Andrew couldn't reconcile? That I could be both the devoted wife who treasured our connection and the strategic businesswoman who had orchestrated a takeover of his family company without his knowledge? The phone in my hand buzzed with notifications. Financial news alerts already picking up rumors of the change at Harrington Global. Messages from colleagues seeking confirmation. A text from my mother asking if I was all right. Somehow sensing, from halfway across the country, that this was a day of significance. I moved to respond to some of these, to manage the unfolding narrative, but instead found myself staring at the last text exchange with Andrew from earlier that morning. Mundane messages about coffee and meeting schedules that now seemed to belong to an entirely different reality. I typed a new message to him. Whatever you're feeling is valid. Take the time you need. Just know that everything I've done, both the parts you agree with and those you don't, has been in service of creating something better than what was, for the company, for us, for the future we talked about building together. My finger hovered over the send button. Was it too soon? Would it seem like an attempt to manage him as skillfully as I had managed the acquisition? I decided against sending it. Some conversations needed to happen in person when he was ready. Instead, I turned my attention to preparation for tomorrow, my first official day as controlling shareholder of Harrington Global Enterprises. There would be meetings with department heads, conversations with key clients to reassure them about the company's direction, careful navigation of the family dynamics that now had an added layer of complexity. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of being dismissed as the outsider, the gold digger who had somehow trapped the second Harrington son, I was now at the center of the very power structure that had sought to marginalize me. Not through marriage or manipulation, but through strategic acumen and business success, they had been too arrogant to recognize or respect. As the evening light faded over Boston Harbor, I found myself at the window again, watching the city transition from day to night. Somewhere out there, Andrew was processing the revelation that had transformed his understanding of me, of his family company, of our shared future. Somewhere out there, Richard and Elizabeth Harrington were likely strategizing how to counter what they would see as a hostile assault on their dynasty. And here I stood at the intersection of personal and professional transformation, having achieved the business objective while risking the relationship that mattered most to me. The familiar ping of an incoming email drew my attention. The press release had gone out. The business world now knew what the Harrington family had learned this morning. By dawn, my name would be associated not with gold digging, but with one of the most strategically brilliant corporate acquisitions in recent memory. My phone rang, Andrew's name and photo appearing on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, his voice steadier than it had been earlier, "about what you said regarding the company's potential, about the vision you presented." "And?" I prompted when he paused. "And I've spent 5 years trying to modernize Harrington Global from within, fighting the same battles over and over against entrenched resistance." I could hear street noise in the background, suggesting he was walking somewhere. Maybe an outside perspective is exactly what's needed. Maybe someone who isn't blinded by tradition or family dynamics can see possibilities that we couldn't. Hope flickered, cautious but real. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm coming home," he said. "We have a lot to talk about trust, about partnership, about what happens next. But we'll do it together, the way we should have from the beginning." The relief was physical. A tension releasing that I hadn't fully acknowledged was there. "I'm glad," I said simply. "I'm still angry," he clarified. "And hurt. But I'm also—" He searched for the word. "Proud. Of what you've built. Of what you saw that my family couldn't see." "Your family includes you," I reminded him gently. "And you saw it too. You just didn't have the freedom to act on it that I did." "Maybe that's the ultimate irony," he replied, a hint of his usual thoughtfulness returning. "That it took someone outside the Harrington legacy to save the Harrington legacy." As we ended the call, I knew we had difficult conversations ahead. Trust to rebuild, new boundaries to establish between our personal and professional lives. But beneath all that was the foundation that had brought us together in the first place. A shared vision of what business could be when liberated from the constraints of tradition for tradition's sake. The whispers of gold digger would fade, replaced by recognition of what I had always been. A strategic thinker who saw value where others saw only the surface, who built rather than extracted, who transformed rather than consumed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, both personal and professional. But for now, I allowed myself a moment to recognize what had been accomplished and what remained possible. Harrington Global Enterprises had a new future ahead, one defined by innovation, merit, and genuine impact rather than inherited position and resistance to change. And perhaps Andrew and I had a new beginning as well, one built on a more complex but ultimately stronger understanding of each other, where my strategic mind was no longer something to be politely overlooked at family gatherings, but recognized as the asset it had always been. The gold digger, it turned out, had been mining for something far more valuable than wealth all along: the opportunity to create lasting, meaningful change. The weeks following my revelation at the board meeting transformed both Harrington Global and my personal life in ways I had anticipated and in others I hadn't foreseen. The business press had a field day with the story. Headlines ranged from "Tech entrepreneur orchestrates brilliant takeover of old money empire" to "Harrington heir's wife reveals secret identity as business mogul." The narrative quickly shifted from initial assumptions about a family power struggle to recognition of a strategic business move that analysts were calling brilliantly executed and long overdue. Andrew and I had reached a tentative peace. After that first night apart, he had returned home, and we had talked until dawn. Painful, honest conversations about trust, partnership, and the line between strategic necessity and personal deception. He understood my reasoning, even as he struggled with the method, and I recognized that my single-minded focus on the business objective had blinded me to the emotional impact my secrecy would have on our relationship. "I keep thinking about all those nights you were working late," he said during one of our late-night conversations on the balcony of our apartment. The city lights spread before us. All those times I thought you were building your company, you were actually taking control of mine. I was doing both, I replied, choosing my words carefully. And I never thought of Harrington Global as yours in the sense of something that belonged to you personally. It was always a public company that happened to be controlled by your family. He sipped his whiskey thoughtfully. A distinction. That makes perfect sense to you as a businesswoman and feels entirely different to me as a Harrington. This was the challenge we continued to navigate. The intersection of personal identity and professional reality. The place where business, strategy met family legacy. At Harrington Global itself, the changes were proceeding more smoothly than even I had anticipated. The initial shock gave way to a strange sense of relief among many employees and executives who had long recognized the need for modernization, but had been powerless to overcome the family's resistance. Edward Ramsey, the brilliant head of product, development whose innovations had been repeatedly shelved by James in favor of maintaining traditional product lines, stopped by my new office on the third day after the announcement. "I've been waiting 5 years to show someone this," he said, placing a prototype on my desk. It was a smaller, more efficient version of our flagship industrial component, integrated with IoT capabilities that would allow predictive maintenance and data-driven optimization. "James told me it was too radical a departure from what our customers expect," Edward explained, his eyes lighting up as I examined the prototype. "But I've been talking to those same customers for years. They're desperate for exactly this kind of innovation." "How quickly can we move this to production?" I asked, already seeing the market potential. Edward's smile was answer enough. Throughout the company, similar scenes played out. Engineers, designers, and managers who had been stifled by tradition suddenly finding their ideas not just heard, but embraced. Not everyone adapted so enthusiastically, of course. As expected, James resigned in a flurry of legal threats and public statements about family betrayal that gained little traction once the financial press began reporting on the string of poor investment decisions and misleading financial reports that had characterized his tenure as CFO. Charlotte surprised me by requesting a meeting 2 weeks after the takeover. I had expected her resignation to follow James's, but instead she arrived at my office with a proposal for restructuring the company's charitable foundation to focus on technology education for underserved communities. "I may not have your business acumen," she acknowledged with uncharacteristic humility, "but I know our social landscape. I know which initiatives will generate meaningful impact versus performative philanthropy." I studied her across my desk, the woman who had dismissed me as an outsider for 3 years now offering her expertise in an area where she genuinely had value to add. "Why this change of heart?" I asked directly. Charlotte smoothed her skirt, a nervous gesture I'd never seen from her before. "Andrew told me something that made me think. He said you didn't acquire Harrington Global to destroy it, but to transform it. That you saw potential where others saw only tradition." She met my gaze with new clarity. "I'd like to be part of that transformation in an area where I can actually contribute something meaningful." It was the beginning of an unlikely alliance. Charlotte's social connections, deployed with genuine purpose rather than status maintenance, opened doors to community partnerships that might have taken me years to develop on my own. Richard's adaptation was more complex. After a week of silence following the board meeting, he requested a private lunch at his club, neutral territory that nonetheless represented the old money Boston world he inhabited. "I've spent 50 years building this company," he began, once we were seated in a corner booth surrounded by dark wood paneling and portraits of stern-faced men from previous centuries. "Expanded it from my father's regional manufacturing business into a global enterprise." I nodded, letting him establish his narrative before responding. "I've also watched the business landscape change around us," he continued, surprising me with his candor. watched competitors adapt to technologies and markets that seemed foreign to our way of doing things. He paused, studying me with new consideration. You know, when Andrew first brought you home, Elizabeth and I saw only what we expected to see. A young woman from a background entirely different from ours. Someone who couldn't possibly understand the weight of legacy and tradition that defines families like ours. And now? I prompted when he fell silent. Now I'm forced to acknowledge that you understood something about our company that I refused to see. That tradition without innovation becomes stagnation. That legacy without adaptation becomes irrelevance. He straightened his tie, a gesture so characteristically Harrington that it almost made me smile despite the tension. I don't approve of your methods, but I cannot argue with your assessment. It wasn't an apology, but from Richard Harrington, it was as close as I was likely to get to an acknowledgement that perhaps his judgment had been flawed. The Harrington name still matters, I told him. Your relationships with legacy clients, your understanding of the industry's history, these have value. I'd like you to remain as Chairman Emeritus, focusing on client relationships and institutional knowledge transfer. The position was largely ceremonial, but it allowed him to save face within his social circle while providing a graceful transition. To my surprise, he accepted with something approaching gratitude. You're not what I expected, he admitted as our lunch concluded. I know, I replied. That's been my advantage all along. Elizabeth proved the most resistant to the new reality. She canceled our standing monthly lunch and declined to attend the first executive dinner Andrew and I hosted at our home. Her absence was conspicuous, a statement more pointed than any words could have been. Give her time, Andrew advised. She's lost not just control of the company, but her entire self-conception as the matriarch of a dynasty. I understood intellectually, but found myself unexpectedly hurt by her rejection. Despite the subtle condescension that had characterized our relationship, I had harbored hope that once she saw my true capabilities, we might build something resembling respect, if not warmth. Some relationships can't be transformed, my mother reminded me during one of our weekly calls. Some people's identities are too wrapped up in hierarchies to accept their disruption. My mother, who had immigrated with nothing but determination and a dream of education for her daughter, had developed a philosopher's perspective on status and its fragility. She had met the Harringtons only twice, once at our wedding and once during a holiday gathering where Elizabeth had made pointed comments about cultural differences that my mother had met with gracious amusement rather than offense. Your victory isn't in winning her approval, my mother continued. It's in rendering her approval irrelevant. 6 weeks after the takeover, Harrington Global hosted its quarterly all-hands meeting in the company's main auditorium. As the new controlling shareholder and CEO, I would be addressing the assembled employees for the first time in this capacity. Andrew had been named Chief Innovation Officer, a position that leveraged his vision and strategic thinking while maintaining appropriate governance boundaries given our personal relationship. I stood backstage reviewing my notes one final time. Through the curtain, I could see the auditorium filling. Engineers in casual attire from the R&D division mixing with suited executives from finance, manufacturing team leaders in company, polos alongside administrative staff. Nearly 2,000 employees in person, with others joining via video link from facilities across the globe. Andrew appeared at my side, straightening my jacket collar with a gesture that had become something of a ritual between us. Nervous? He asked. Focused? I corrected, though in truth there were butterflies. This wasn't just any corporate address. It was the formal introduction of my leadership to the people whose livelihoods depended on the company's success. They're ready for this, Andrew said, seeming to read my thoughts. More ready than... They know. The old guard was respected but feared. You have the chance to be respected and followed. There's a difference. The introduction began. A a brief overview of my background that sounded surreal even to my ears. MIT graduate, technology entrepreneur, founder of a billion-dollar AI company, and now controlling shareholder of one of Boston's oldest manufacturing enterprises. Titles that captured the milestones but missed the journey. The nights studying while helping at my mother's small business. The investor doors slammed in my face before the first breakthrough. The constant need to prove myself in rooms where I was perpetually underestimated. I walked onto the stage to applause that felt cautious but genuine. The spotlight was bright, but not as blinding as the scrutiny I had faced in that boardroom 6 weeks earlier. "Good morning," I began, setting aside my prepared notes. The moment called for authenticity rather than scripted remarks. Many of you know me as Andrew Harrington's wife. Some of you may have heard rumors about the takeover of Harrington Global. Today, I want to speak directly about who I am, why I'm here, and most importantly, where we're going together. I paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some curious, some apprehensive, some openly hopeful. I grew up the daughter of an immigrant who taught me that success comes not from where you start, but from your capacity to learn, adapt, and see possibilities others miss. I built my technology company based on that principle, identifying inefficiencies in complex systems and developing solutions that others thought impossible. The room was silent now, attentive in a way that suggested they were hearing more than corporate platitudes. For the past 3 years, I've observed Harrington Global from a unique position, close enough to see its tremendous potential, but outside the traditions and assumptions that have limited its growth. What I saw was a company with world-class talent, remarkable capabilities, and a legacy of quality that competitors envy. I moved away from the podium, choosing to walk the stage rather than remain static behind a barrier. I also saw a company constrained by outdated hierarchies, resistant to technological innovation, and structured to preserve tradition rather than create value. A company where ideas were evaluated based on who proposed them rather than their potential impact. Where talented individuals hit artificial ceilings because they didn't have the right name or background or connections. A ripple of recognition moved through the audience, the unspoken truth that many had experienced but few had been able to address. My acquisition of controlling interest wasn't about destroying Harrington's legacy. It was about transforming it, building on its strengths while eliminating the constraints that have limited its potential. I outlined the changes already in motion. The technological overhaul of manufacturing systems, the expansion into emerging markets, the implementation of a genuine meritocracy throughout the organization. With each point, I highlighted specific employees whose ideas were now being fast-tracked after years of being shelved or ignored. Maria Diaz's inventory management system, which was rejected 3 times by previous leadership, will be implemented company-wide by the end of the quarter. Early testing shows it reduces waste by 42% while improving fulfillment times. Maria, sitting in the 4th row, straightened with visible pride as colleagues turned to acknowledge her. Robert Chen's designs for our next generation. Components, which have been sitting in a drawer for 2 years because they were deemed too different from our traditional offerings, are now in accelerated development. The 3 clients who've seen prototypes have already placed preliminary orders. Robert, a brilliant engineer who had nearly left for a competitor after years of frustration, nodded with quiet satisfaction. One by one, I recognized individuals throughout the organization whose contributions had been overlooked or undervalued, making clear that in the new Harrington Global, merit would matter more than hierarchy, innovation more than tradition, results more than relationships. This transformation won't be easy, I acknowledged, shifting to the challenges ahead. Change never is. Some of our longtime clients may be hesitant about our new direction. Some of our internal processes will need complete reimagining. Some roles will evolve in ways that may feel uncomfortable at first. I paused, making eye contact with different sections of the audience. But the alternative to transformation isn't stability, it's decline. In today's business environment, companies either evolve or they fade. And Harrington Global has too much potential, too much talent, too much to offer the world to accept anything less than excellence. The energy in the room had shifted from cautious attention to something approaching excitement. I could see it in the postures, the expressions, the notes being rapidly taken. I stand before you not just as the new controlling shareholder, but as someone who believes that Harrington Global's best days lie ahead of us, not behind us. Someone who sees your potential not through the lens of where you came from or who you know, but based on what you can contribute and create. As I concluded, the applause was no longer cautious, but enthusiastic, even from corners of the organization I had expected to be most resistant. Not universal. I noted a few arms firmly crossed, a few expressions defiantly skeptical, but broad enough to suggest that the company was ready for the changes I was implementing. Andrew joined me on stage for the Q&A session that followed, the two of us fielding questions about everything from specific technology investments to changes in the organizational structure. Our different perspectives complemented each other, his institutional knowledge balancing my outsider's viewpoint, his understanding of the company's history informing my vision for its future. One question from the manufacturing division cut to the heart of the transition. The Harrington name has always stood for tradition and stability, a longtime plant manager said. How do we maintain our identity while implementing all these changes? It was Andrew who answered. The Harrington name doesn't belong to the past, he said with a conviction that surprised even me. It belongs to all of us who build this company's future. My great-grandfather started Harrington Manufacturing because he saw an opportunity to create something new, not because he wanted to establish a dynasty. Somewhere along the way, we confused preservation with purpose. He looked at me, then back at the audience. The most meaningful way to honor our legacy isn't to freeze it in time, but to ensure that the Harrington name continues to represent excellence, innovation, and value, not just for my family, but for everyone who contributes to its success. It was the perfect bridge between respect for the company's history and embrace of its evolution, delivered by the one person whose Harrington credentials were unimpeachable. After the meeting, we walked through the building together, stopping to talk with employees, listening to ideas and concerns with equal attention. The difference from just 6 weeks earlier was palpable. People approached me directly rather than deferring to Andrew, spoke freely about challenges rather than maintaining the polite fictions that had characterized the previous regime. They've been waiting for this, Andrew observed as we rode the elevator back to the executive floor. Not just for change, but for the permission to imagine possibilities beyond the way we've always done things. And you? I asked, studying his profile. What have you been waiting for? He considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. I think I've been waiting to reconcile the company I believed Harrington Global could be with the company my family insisted it must remain. He turned to face me fully. You've made that reconciliation possible, though not in the way anyone expected. Back in my office, Richard's former domain now transformed with cleaner lines and more natural light, I found an unexpected visitor waiting. Elizabeth Harrington sat in one of the guest chairs, her posture as perfect as always, her expression unreadable. Elizabeth? I said, surprised. I wasn't aware we had a meeting scheduled. We don't, she replied, rising with deliberate grace. I wanted to see it for myself. The changes, the new direction. I gestured for her to sit again, taking the chair beside her rather than establishing the power dynamic of the desk between us. Andrew, sensing the delicacy of the moment, quietly excused himself. What do you think? I asked directly. She took her time answering, looking around the office with its new layout, the technology that had replaced heavy furniture. the wall that now displayed employee innovations rather than family portraits. "It's different," she finally said, which, from Elizabeth, constituted neither approval nor condemnation. "The company, the employees, Richard." She paused. "Even Andrew seems different." "Change often reveals aspects of ourselves we didn't recognize before," I observed carefully. "Yes," she agreed unexpectedly, "including the capacity for adaptation that I apparently lacked, until faced with no alternative." It was the closest thing to self-awareness I had ever heard from my mother-in-law. "You know," she continued, smoothing her skirt with practiced hands, "when Andrew first brought you home, I saw only the ways. You didn't fit. Your background, your directness, your unwillingness to adapt to our traditions. I never bothered to see what you actually brought to the table." I remained silent, recognizing the rarity of this moment. "Richard told me about your proposal for his emeritus role," she said. "About the way you've repositioned Charlotte in the foundation. About how you haven't simply discarded the family but found places where each can contribute meaningfully." "The Harrington name still has value," I replied. "And family knowledge still matters. What needed to change was the automatic assumption that family connection alone qualified someone for leadership." Elizabeth nodded slightly. "I've spent 40 years as a Harrington by marriage, building my identity around what that name represents. It's challenging to recalibrate." "I understand more than you might think," I told her. "I've spent 3 years as a Harrington by marriage, too, but being seen primarily as an outsider who couldn't possibly understand what that name meant." Our eyes met with new recognition. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps the beginning of mutual respect. Two women who had married into the same family but experienced it from vastly different positions. One embraced for the social connection she brought, one tolerated despite the capabilities she possessed. "The annual Harbor Charity Gala is next month," Elizabeth said, changing course with the social dexterity that had always been her strength. "Traditionally, as the company's lead, you would chair the event. I heard the olive branch being extended. I'd welcome your guidance." "On the transition," I replied, "there's institutional knowledge there that would take me years to develop independently." "Yes," she agreed with the first genuine smile I had ever seen her direct at me. "There is." As she rose to leave, she paused at the door. "You're not what I expected," she said, unconsciously echoing Richard's words from our lunch. "No," I agreed. "I'm not what anyone expected. That's been both my challenge and my advantage." 6 months after the takeover, Harrington Global hosted a manufacturing technology exposition at its newly renovated Innovation Center, formerly an underutilized warehouse that now showcased the company's latest developments. Industry leaders, clients, and analysts gathered to see firsthand the transformation that business publications were calling the Harrington Renaissance. Andrew and I moved through the space together, stopping at various demonstrations where employees proudly showcased their work. The energy was palpable, not the forced enthusiasm of corporate events, but the genuine excitement of people finally able to bring their best ideas to life. "Ms. Chen," called a voice from across the room. It was Maria Diaz, now heading our inventory management division. "The Singapore team is ready for the live demonstration whenever you are." I smiled at her use of my birth name, a choice I had made professionally while keeping Harrington for personal matters. It created a useful separation between my role as CEO and my position as Andrew's wife, though the distinction was sometimes lost on others. "We'll be right there," I assured her. As we crossed the exhibition floor, I noticed Richard and Elizabeth speaking with several longtime clients, Charlotte leading a group of community partners through the Foundation's new education initiative, and various Harrington relatives who had maintained their distance now cautiously engaging with the company's evolution. "Quite a different scene from last year's family Christmas party," Andrew observed wryly, clearly following my gaze. Yes, I agreed. Though I suspect your mother is still keeping a mental scorecard of who's embracing the changes and who's resisting. He laughed. Some traditions are harder to break than others. We paused before joining the demonstration, taking a moment to observe the transformation around us, not just of the physical space or the business metrics that had shown remarkable improvement, but of the culture itself. People moved with purpose and spoke with confidence, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. Ideas flowed freely across departmental boundaries. Even the relationship between the Harrington family and the company they had founded had evolved into something more balanced, more productive. You know what I realized recently? Andrew said, his voice thoughtful. If my family hadn't been so dismissive of you, if they had bothered to see beyond their assumptions and actually recognize your capabilities, you might never have felt compelled to take control this way. True, I acknowledged. Their underestimation created the opportunity. Their dismissal of your ideas created the necessity. So, in a way, he continued with ironic amusement, by treating you like an outsider who married me for money and status, they actually precipitated exactly the outcome they feared most, losing control of the company. The self-fulfilling prophecy of prejudice, I observed, though not in the way anyone anticipated. As we prepared to join the demonstration, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the display screens. No longer the cautious outsider navigating a world determined to keep her at its margins, but a leader comfortable in her authority, respected for her vision rather than tolerated for her marriage. The whispers of gold digger had long since faded, replaced by headlines about visionary leadership and strategic brilliance. The woman they had dismissed as nothing more than an opportunistic marriage partner had transformed their company, modernized their business model, and in the process, perhaps even saved the Harrington legacy from the complacency that had threatened to render it irrelevant. Ready? Andrew asked, his hand finding mine in a gesture that bridged our personal and professional connection. Ready, I confirmed, stepping forward into the future we were building, not as an outsider who had seized control, but as a leader who had earned her place through capability rather than connection, through vision rather than inheritance. The gold digger, it turned out, had never been interested in the Harrington wealth. The real treasure had been the potential they hadn't recognized in their own company, potential that now, finally, was being realized. 1 year after the acquisition, I stood at the window of my office at Harrington Global, watching the Boston Harbor in the distance. The company quarterly results had just been released, showing a 46% increase in profitability, expanding market share in 3 continents, and the successful launch of 6 new product lines that industry analysts were calling revolutionary for their integration of AI and sustainable manufacturing practices. The stock price had doubled, making my investment not just a strategic victory, but a financial one as well. Yet the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The true transformation was visible in the halls of Harrington Tower itself. The stifling hierarchy that had characterized the company for generations had given way to a culture of innovation where ideas flowed freely across departments and up through management. Employees who had once kept their heads down, doing exactly what was expected and nothing more, now brought their full creativity and ambition to work each day. The walls of the executive floor, once lined with portraits of stern-faced Harrington patriarchs, now showcased employee innovations and recognition of teams who had surpassed expectations. My phone chimed with a message from Andrew. Don't forget. Dinner with my parents at 7. Mother specifically requested your presence. I smiled at the subtle shift in wording. No longer Elizabeth's reluctant inclusion of her son's wife, but a specific request for my company. The past year had brought changes not just to Harrington Global, but to family dynamics as well, though those transformations had been harder won and remained more fragile. The journey from gold digger to respected business leader had not been without its challenges. James had eventually abandoned his legal threats when his lawyers made clear that my acquisition had been executed with meticulous attention to regulatory requirements. But he had established a rival venture with several former Harrington executives, who had resigned rather than adapt to the new culture. Their startup was struggling to gain traction, lacking both the Harrington name and the innovative direction needed to compete in today's market. Charlotte had surprised everyone by thriving in her new role leading the Harrington Foundation's technology education initiatives. Freed from the pressure to maintain a position she was never suited for in the company proper, she had discovered genuine passion for connecting privileged resources with underserved communities. Our unlikely alliance had evolved into something approaching friendship, built on mutual respect for our different strengths, rather than the condescension that had characterized our early interactions. Richard had settled into his emeritus role with grudging acceptance that gradually shifted toward engagement as he saw the company's success under new leadership. His decades of industry connections proved valuable in opening doors with traditional clients who might otherwise have been hesitant about our more innovative approaches. The arrangement allowed him to maintain his standing in Boston society circles while adapting to his new reality. Elizabeth had been the last holdout, maintaining a chilly distance for months after the acquisition. Her identity had been so thoroughly intertwined with her position as the Harrington matriarch that my disruption of the company hierarchy had felt like a personal attack. Yet something had shifted in recent weeks, small gestures that suggested a thawing of relations. The dinner invitation tonight marked another step in that gradual process. A knock at my door pulled me from my reflections. Olivia Chen, the brilliant engineer I had recruited from MIT to lead our AI integration division, entered with barely contained excitement. "We got it," she announced without preamble. "The Sullivan contract. They're shutting down negotiations with Henderson Tech and giving us exclusive rights to develop the next generation systems." The Sullivan Group was the largest industrial conglomerate in the Midwest, a traditionally conservative organization that had been a Henderson client for decades. Their business represented not just significant revenue, but a symbolic victory. Evidence that even the most traditional industrial clients were recognizing the value of our innovative approach. "What pushed them over the edge?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Miranda grinned. "Edwards' prototype demonstration. When they saw the efficiency gains and cost savings in real time, their CEO actually said, and I'm quoting here, 'This makes Henderson's offering look like ancient history.'" Edward Ramsey had flourished under the new Harrington Global structure, his previously ignored innovations now forming the centerpiece of our most successful product lines. His team had expanded from a marginalized group of 3 engineers to a division of 30, with resources to match their ambition. Stories like his were repeated throughout the company. Talented individuals who had been constrained by tradition now unleashed to achieve their full potential. "That's fantastic news," I said, genuinely pleased both for the business win and for the validation it represented. "Make sure Edward's team gets proper recognition for this." "Already done," Miranda assured me. "Public acknowledgement in the company update, and I've recommended performance bonuses for the key developers." This too was part of the new Harrington culture. Recognition based on contribution rather than position. Rewards flowing to those who created value regardless of title or tenure. "There's one more thing," Miranda added, her expression shifting to something more contemplative. "Henderson's CEO called me directly this morning. They're interested in acquisition talks." Henderson Technologies had been our chief competitor for decades, a family-owned business similar to what Harrington had been before my takeover, though without quite the same pedigree or social standing. Their approach to business had remained stubbornly traditional, and their market position had suffered accordingly as we implemented our more innovative strategy. "They've seen our quarterly results," I observed, "and the Sullivan contract was probably the final straw." Miranda nodded. "Their CEO essentially admitted they can't compete with our integration of AI and advanced manufacturing techniques. They're falling behind and they know it." "What's your assessment?" I asked, valuing her perspective not just as a technological expert, but as someone who understood the market dynamics. Acquiring them gives us their client base and manufacturing capacity, which would accelerate our expansion plans by about 18 months, she analyzed. Their technology is outdated, but their physical infrastructure is solid. The right management could transform their operations just as we've done here. And their corporate culture? Similar to what Harrington was before you took over, she said bluntly. Hierarchical, tradition-bound, resistant to change. The family is heavily involved in day-to-day operations, often overruling their more forward-thinking executives. It was like looking into a mirror of Harrington Global's past. Another company constrained not by lack of talent or resources, but by an outdated approach to leadership and innovation. Draft an initial analysis, I decided. Pros, cons, integration, challenges, cultural considerations. We'll discuss it at tomorrow's strategy meeting. After Miranda left, I returned to the window, considering the implications of this potential acquisition. Had I become what I once disrupted, an industry consolidator using financial leverage to reshape the competitive landscape? Or was this a natural evolution of the transformation I had begun, extending our innovative approach to another organization trapped in outdated traditions? The questions lingered as I prepared for dinner with the Harringtons. Andrew and I agreed to meet at his parents' Beacon Hill home, rather than arriving together. A small concession to the ongoing negotiation of our professional and personal boundaries. The past year had strengthened our relationship in unexpected ways. The initial breach of trust giving way to more honest communication about expectations and assumptions that might otherwise have remained unspoken. I still don't entirely approve of how you did it, he had said one night, months after the acquisition. But I've come to understand why you felt it was necessary. And the results speak for themselves. His position as Chief Innovation Officer had evolved from potentially awkward to genuinely effective as his ideas, previously sidelined by family politics, found fertile ground in the company's new culture. His understanding of both the industry's traditions and its future potential made him uniquely valuable in this transition period. The Harrington home looked exactly as it had the first time I visited: imposing Georgian architecture, tasteful, holiday decorations befitting the season, the subtle signifiers of old Boston money evident in every carefully curated detail. Yet my experience of it had transformed completely. No longer the intimidated outsider trying to navigate unfamiliar social codes, I now entered with the quiet confidence that came from knowing my own value, independent of their assessment. Richard answered the door himself, rather than the staff member who would typically perform this function, a small but significant departure from protocol that registered immediately. Olivia. He greeted me with a nod that contained neither the coldness of our early interactions nor the condescension that had often followed. Andrew's caught in traffic. Elizabeth is in the library. The formality of his manner remained, but the underlying current had shifted from barely concealed disdain to something approaching respect. I followed him through the familiar hallways, noting how my perception of the space had changed. What once seemed designed to intimidate now appeared as what it truly was: a carefully maintained facade constructed to project an image of unassailable privilege and tradition. Elizabeth rose as we entered the library, another departure from our previous dynamic where she would typically remain seated to establish her position in the social hierarchy. "Olivia," she said, offering her hand. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation," I replied, the familiar social script now carrying different undertones. We moved through the rituals of pre-dinner drinks with well-practiced ease, discussing neutral topics like the unseasonably mild weather and mutual acquaintances' recent travels. Richard inquired about a specific client relationship in a way that acknowledged my leadership position without explicitly referencing the changed power dynamic. Elizabeth mentioned a charity event where the Harrington Foundation, now under Charlotte's direction, would be featured prominently. When Andrew finally arrived, apologizing for the traffic delay, the energy in the room shifted subtly. Despite all the changes of the past year, he remained the bridge between my world and theirs, the connection point that made this awkward family dinner both necessary and possible. "I hear congratulations are in order," Richard remarked as we moved to the dining room. "The quarterly results are quite impressive. The Sullivan contract in particular," Andrew added, a hint of pride in his voice. "Father, you remember how many years we tried to break into their supply chain?" 8 years of relationship building," Richard acknowledged, though they always seemed more comfortable with Henderson's more traditional approach. "Until they saw the difference our integrated systems could make to their bottom line," I noted. "Innovation eventually speaks for itself when the results are quantifiable." "Yes," Elizabeth said unexpectedly. "Results do have a way of silencing criticism." The comment hung in the air, loaded with implications that extended far beyond business performance. I met her gaze directly, recognizing the opening she had provided. "Indeed," I agreed, "though adaptation can be challenging even when the benefits are clear." "Some adaptations more than others," she replied with a pointed look that acknowledged our shared understanding of her difficult adjustment to the new reality. The dinner proceeded with a strange combination of familiar formality and new undertones of reluctant respect. Conversation moved from business to wider Boston society, the upcoming symphony season, Richard's recent appointment to the board of the Museum of Fine Arts, the typical topics of Harrington dinner conversation, yet now including me as a participant, rather than an observed outsider. As dessert was served, Elizabeth set down her fork with deliberate precision. "I believe I owe you an apology, Olivia." The unexpectedness of this statement momentarily silenced the table. Richard looked as surprised as I felt, while Andrew watched his mother with careful attention. "I misjudged you," Elizabeth continued when I didn't immediately respond. "Not just your capabilities, which have been amply demonstrated, but your intentions regarding the company." "My intentions were never what you assumed," I said carefully. "No," she agreed. "I thought you married Andrew for access to our world, our connections, our position. I never considered that you might see something in Harrington Global that we ourselves had become blind to." It was the most direct acknowledgement I had received from any family member about their mistaken assumptions, delivered with Elizabeth's characteristic precision but unusual humility. "The company needed transformation," I acknowledged, though I understand why that reality was difficult to accept, especially given the family's long history with the business. "Pride," Richard interjected, surprising me further. "Pride and complacency. We had convinced ourselves that tradition was sufficient protection against changing market forces." "The Harrington name does still carry value," I offered, recognizing the concession they were making. The company's legacy of quality and reliability remains one of its greatest strengths. It simply needed to evolve rather than remain static. "Like all things," Elizabeth observed with unexpected philosophical depth, "even Beacon Hill families must adapt or become irrelevant." The remainder of the evening continued in this vein of cautious rapprochement. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual recognition that the landscape had irrevocably changed and we were all finding our new positions within it. When Andrew and I departed, Elizabeth surprised me with a brief embrace rather than the formal handshake that had characterized our previous partings. "Henderson Technologies," she said quietly as we separated. "Richard served on a committee with their CEO last year. He mentioned significant cash flow problems despite their public statements. The unsolicited intelligence was both useful business information and a personal overture, Elizabeth offering value in our new relationship dynamic." "Thank you," I replied simply. "That's helpful context." In the car, Andrew turned to me with raised eyebrows. That was unexpected. Your mother is nothing if not strategic, I observed. She's recognized the new reality and is positioning herself accordingly. Don't underestimate the personal element, he countered. Your success has forced them to confront their prejudices in a way nothing else could have. Results, as Mother said, silence criticism. We drove through the familiar Boston streets, the city lights reflecting off the harbor as we crossed the bridge toward our apartment. Henderson reached out about acquisition discussions, I mentioned, shifting to the business development that had occupied my thoughts earlier. I heard rumors, he acknowledged. How serious do you think they are? Miranda believes they're genuinely struggling to compete with our technological integration. The Sullivan contract was likely the catalyst for their outreach. Andrew considered this, his professional analysis temporarily superseding family considerations. Their manufacturing capacity would accelerate our expansion plans, and their client relationships in the Midwest would complement our stronger positions on the coasts. The cultural integration would be challenging, I noted. They're very similar to what Harrington was before, family-controlled, tradition-bound, resistant to innovation. A smile touched his lips. Good thing we have some experience with that particular transformation. Indeed, I agreed, though this would be by mutual agreement rather than through the market mechanisms I used with Harrington. The distinction lingered between us. The acknowledgement that my acquisition of his family's company, however ultimately beneficial, had been executed without their knowledge or consent. The wound had healed considerably over the past year, but the scar tissue remained, a permanent reminder of choices made and trust temporarily broken. What would you have done differently? He asked suddenly. If you could go back to the beginning of your acquisition strategy, knowing what you know now about the impact on us, on our relationship. I considered the question seriously, watching the city skyline as we approached our building. I would have found a way to involve you earlier in the process, I finally said. Not at the beginning. The legal complications and potential accusations of insider trading were real concerns. But before the final stage, before the board meeting revelation. Why? Because I underestimated the emotional impact on you, I admitted. I approached it as a purely business transaction, separating the corporate entity from the family identity in a way that made logical sense to me, but didn't account for your lifetime of connection to both. He nodded, accepting the answer. And I might have better prepared my family for the inevitable changes that were coming had I known. The transition could have been smoother, less traumatic for everyone involved. Perhaps, I agreed. Though sometimes disruption is necessary for true transformation. Gradual change can be too easily resisted or diluted. We had reached our building, the conversation pausing as we made our way through the lobby and up to our apartment. Once, inside, Andrew poured us both a glass of wine, continuing the thread of our discussion. What about Henderson? He asked. Would you approach their acquisition differently, given what you've learned? Yes, I said without hesitation. This time, the transformation can be collaborative rather than confrontational. We can be transparent about our intentions and the changes we believe are necessary, while maintaining the leverage that comes from their weaker market position, he noted with a wry smile. Business is still business, I agreed, but there's room for humanity in how we execute the strategy. We moved to the balcony despite the December chill, looking out at the city that housed both our companies, mine a technology innovator that had upended traditional markets, his a century-old manufacturing enterprise now reinvented for the modern era. You know what's ironic? Andrew said, after a comfortable silence. If my family hadn't been so dismissive of you from the beginning, if they had bothered to actually see your capabilities rather than just your background, you might never have felt the need to take control of Harrington Global. True, I acknowledged. Their underestimation created both the opportunity and the motivation. So their fear of an outsider gold digger infiltrating the family business actually created the very outcome they were afraid of, he continued. Though not in the way they imagined. The self-fulfilling prophecy of prejudice, I observed, though the results have benefited everyone involved, the company, its employees, its shareholders, even your family, though they might not all recognize that yet. He turned to face me fully, his expression thoughtful. Would you do it again? Knowing everything that would follow? The business success, the family tension, the personal challenges between us? Yes, I said without hesitation, though perhaps with more attention to the human elements alongside the strategic ones. The company needed transformation, and sometimes transformation requires disruption. And us? He asked. The question that still lingered beneath all our professional successes and challenges. We needed transformation too, I said softly. From the carefully maintained divisions between your world and mine to something more authentic, more equal. From you protecting me from your family's judgment to us standing together as partners in every sense. He nodded, understanding what I meant. Our relationship before the acquisition had been loving but constrained by unspoken boundaries. His family's business an arena where I was merely the tolerated outsider. My technology company a separate world he supported from a respectful distance. Partners, he agreed, raising his glass to mine. In business and in life. The next morning brought a flurry of activity related to the potential Henderson acquisition. My team had prepared preliminary analyses of their financial position, market vulnerabilities, and cultural challenges. As suspected, Elizabeth's intelligence proved accurate. Despite public statements of stability, Henderson was facing significant cash flow problems resulting from their failure to adapt to changing market demands. In a strategy meeting with our executive team, including Andrew in his role as Chief Innovation Officer, we debated approaches to the acquisition discussions. They're vulnerable but not desperate yet, our CFO assessed. We could wait 6 months and potentially get a better price as their position weakens further. At the risk of them seeking another buyer or attempting a major restructuring in the meantime, Miranda countered. The value for us isn't just in acquiring them at the lowest possible price, but in integrating their manufacturing capacity and client relationships into our expansion strategy. Andrew, who had remained thoughtful throughout the discussion, finally spoke. There's another consideration beyond the financial and strategic elements. Henderson is a family company with a 70-year history. Their employees, their community involvement, their legacy, these have value that won't appear on a balance sheet. The room fell quiet, recognizing the parallel to Harrington's own recent history. What are you suggesting? I asked, genuinely interested in his perspective. A respectful approach, he replied. One that acknowledges their contributions and heritage while being honest about the changes needed. An integration plan that preserves what works while transforming what doesn't. It was the approach I had come to myself after our conversation. The previous night, a synthesis of strategic necessity and human consideration. The lesson learned from my own experience with Harrington Global now applied to our engagement with Henderson. I agree, I said, nodding to Andrew before addressing the wider team. We'll approach them with a fair offer based on current valuation, not waiting for further deterioration of their position. We'll be transparent about our integration plans, including which aspects of their operations we value and which would need significant transformation. And the Henderson family's involvement going forward? Our head of legal inquired, another echo of our own recent history. We'll assess each family member's contributions based on merit rather than name. I decided. Those with genuine value to add will be offered appropriate roles. Those who have held positions solely through family connection will be offered respectful transitions. The meeting continued with tactical discussions of valuation models, integration timelines, and communication strategies. Throughout, I was aware of how different this approach was from my acquisition of Harrington Global, collaborative rather than confrontational, transparent rather than covert. The business objective remained similar, but the human elements had been elevated alongside the strategic ones. After the meeting, Andrew lingered in the conference room as others filed out. "Thoughts?" I asked, curious about his assessment of the approach we had outlined. "It's a better way," he said simply, "for the business and for the people involved." "Learned from experience," I acknowledged. "The gold digger becomes the mentor," he observed with a smile, reclaiming the term that had once been whispered behind my back and transforming it into something else entirely. An acknowledgement of the journey from outsider to leader, from judged to judge. As we walked together toward our respective offices, I reflected on the transformation of the past year. The whispers had indeed been silenced, replaced by headlines about visionary leadership and strategic brilliance. The woman they had dismissed as nothing more than an opportunistic marriage partner had transformed their company, modernized their business model, and in the process, perhaps even saved the Harrington legacy from the complacency that had threatened to render it irrelevant. More importantly, I had transformed my own understanding of business leadership, from seeing it primarily as a strategic exercise in optimizing systems and resources, to recognizing the human elements that could not be quantified in spreadsheets or algorithms. The prejudice that had initially fueled my determination to prove my worth had evolved into something more nuanced, a vision of business that valued merit over inheritance, innovation over tradition, but also recognized the importance of legacy, connection, and human dignity in the process of transformation. The gold digger, it turned out, had never been interested in the Harrington wealth at all. The real treasure had been the potential they hadn't recognized in their own company, potential that now, finally, was being realized. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.